My name is Camille, and I was standing at the nurses' station on the 7th floor of Miami Harbor General at 2 in the morning when 6 federal agents walked off the elevator, badges raised, and the charge nurse who had spent 8 months trying to get me fired went white as printer paper. 3 hours earlier, I had been sitting in my car in the parking garage, wearing a wire tape beneath my scrub top, listening to a phone in my pocket count down the minutes until my next shift. 3 weeks earlier, I had been escorted into a windowless meeting room by hospital security and accused, in front of my nurse manager, of stealing enough diverted fentanyl and oxycodone to warrant a criminal referral. And 3 months earlier, I had noticed something small and strange in a medication log that everyone else on my unit had learned, one way or another, not to look at too closely. I hadn't been the one stealing the drugs. I hadn't even suspected, at first, how far up the chain the theft actually went, or how many people in that hospital had built careers on making sure nobody like me ever asked the wrong question twice. But by the time the accusation reached my personnel file, it had already served its purpose. It made me the obvious suspect, the disposable one, the night nurse nobody would believe over a well-liked physician, and a charge nurse with 15 years of seniority. What none of them knew, not the charge nurse who'd built the case against me, not the physician who'd been running the operation for the better part of 2 years, not even my own nurse manager, who genuinely believed she was protecting the unit, was that 6 weeks before that meeting room accusation ever happened, I had already walked into a DEA field office on my day off and told an agent named Priscilla Amaro everything I'd found, because I would rather lose my job telling the truth than keep it by staying silent. They thought a false accusation would be enough to make me disappear quietly. They had no idea I'd already been building a case against them for months, and that the FBI hadn't come to that hospital floor to arrest me. 14 months before that night, I was working nights on the Med-Surg and step-down unit at Miami Harbor General, the kind of large urban hospital where the pace never really slowed and the staff turnover never really stopped. I had been a registered nurse for 7 years by then, 5 of them spent working nights, which meant I had developed the particular instincts night nurses develop, a low tolerance for things that didn't add up, and a habit of noticing what the daytime staff, moving faster and thinking about handoff, sometimes missed. The charge nurse on my unit was a woman named Yvette Suarez, who had run nights for over a decade and treated the schedule, the supply closet, and the unofficial social hierarchy of the floor like they were all extensions of her own authority. Yvette wasn't cruel in an obvious way. She was cruel in the efficient way some senior staff become when they've decided a person doesn't matter enough to be careful with. She corrected my documentation in front of new hires. She scheduled me for the unit's worst assignments with a kind of casual consistency that couldn't quite be called intentional and couldn't quite be called accidental either. She had a way of saying "we'll see" when I asked for anything that made it clear the answer was already no. I told myself it didn't matter, the way I always did. I was there for the patients, and the patients, mostly, were the reason the job still felt worth it. The first strange thing I noticed happened on an ordinary Tuesday in October, 12 months before the federal agents walked off that elevator. I was reconciling the automated medication dispensing cabinet, the Pyxis machine that tracked every narcotic pulled by every nurse on every shift, when I noticed a discrepancy in the count for hydromorphone that didn't match the documented waste. It wasn't a large amount. 2 milligrams, unaccounted for, attributed to a patient who, according to the chart, had been discharged 6 hours before the medication was allegedly administered. I flagged it, the way policy required, and thought little more of it until the same pattern appeared again the following week. Different patient, different medication. Same unaccounted gap between what left the cabinet and what reached documented patient care. I brought it to Yvette first because that was the chain of command. Probably a charting error, she said, barely glancing at the printout. Happens all the time on nights. It happened again the next week, and the week after that. By December, I had started keeping my own log, cross-referencing Pyxis withdrawal times against nursing documentation and physician orders, initially just to satisfy my own unease. What I found was a pattern too consistent to be coincidental. Nearly all of the discrepancies traced back to medications ordered by a single physician, Dr. Marcus Reyes, a hospitalist well-liked by staff and administration alike, known for his easy charm with patients' families and his habit of bringing coffee for the night shift. I didn't want to believe what the pattern suggested. I liked Dr. Reyes. Everyone did. That was, I would later understand, precisely the point. In January, I raised the discrepancy again, this time in writing, through the hospital's official compliance reporting system, the kind of anonymous internal channel that exists specifically so staff can report concerns without immediate retaliation. I documented 6 separate instances across 2 months, all traceable to the same prescribing pattern, all involving controlled substances, all involving patients who either couldn't corroborate receiving the medication or had already been discharged. Nothing happened for 3 weeks. Then everything happened at once. I was called into a meeting with the unit's nurse manager, a well-meaning but overwhelmed woman named Carla Whitfield, who informed me uncomfortably that the compliance office had looked into my report and found no evidence of wrongdoing, and that going forward, I should bring any further concerns directly to Yvette instead of escalating through official channels. I understood, even then, what that meant. Someone with more influence than me had made the report disappear. What I didn't understand yet was how deep that influence went. Yvette Suarez, it would later come out in a sworn statement I read months afterward with my stomach in knots, had been receiving cash payments from Dr. Reyes for over a year in exchange for adjusting shift assignments to ensure certain nurses less likely to notice discrepancies, or less likely to report them if they did, were on duty during the shifts when diverted medications needed to move without scrutiny. My compliance report hadn't disappeared by accident. It had been intercepted and buried by someone in Yvette's confidence within the compliance office itself, a relationship that had taken federal investigators months to fully untangle. I didn't know any of that in January. I only knew that the official channel had failed, that Yvette's treatment of me had grown noticeably colder, and that Dr. Reyes had started finding small, polite reasons to ask about my shift schedule. "You work a lot of Thursdays," he mentioned once, refilling his coffee at the nurse's station, his tone perfectly casual. "Rotation or by choice?" I told him it was rotation. I didn't tell him I'd started noticing that the discrepancies clustered heavily on the nights he was on call. By February, I had made a decision I hadn't made lightly. If the hospital's internal system had been compromised, I needed to go outside it. I spent 2 weeks researching how controlled substance diversion cases were typically reported, learned that the DEA maintained a tip line specifically for healthcare diversion, and on my next scheduled day off, drove to the federal building downtown instead of going home to sleep. The agent who met with me that day was Priscilla Amaro, a calm, direct woman in her 40s who listened to my entire account without interrupting once, then spent the next 2 hours asking questions with a precision that made it clear she'd handled cases like this before. "I need you to understand something before we go any further," she told me. "If this is what it looks like, it's bigger than one physician skimming from a Pyxis machine. Diversion at this scale usually means a distribution pipeline on the other end. Someone has to be receiving what's being stolen, and someone has to be selling it. That takes time to build a case around, and it takes patience from you." I told her I understood. What I didn't fully understand yet was how much that patience would cost me personally. Over the following months, I continued working my normal shifts at Miami Harbor General while quietly cooperating with what had, by April, become a joint DEA and FBI investigation into a diversion and resale operation that federal agents believed extended beyond the hospital itself, into at least one independent pharmacy willing to falsify records in exchange for a cut of the resale profits. I kept detailed logs. I photographed discrepancies when I legally could. I answered Agent Amaro's questions during brief, carefully scheduled meetings on my days off, always in places with no connection to the hospital. I told no one at work, not Carla, who I genuinely believed had no idea what was happening beneath her, not the handful of coworkers I still trusted. Agent Amaro had been clear about why. The fewer people who knew, the safer both the investigation and I would remain, and the less risk there was of the wrong person overhearing the wrong conversation. That silence came at a cost I hadn't fully prepared for. Without an explanation for my behavior, I simply looked to everyone around me, like someone quietly falling apart. I was more careful, more withdrawn, more meticulous about documentation than usual, all of which Yvette noticed, and none of which she interpreted charitably. "You've been acting strange," she told me in May, in a tone that managed to sound both concerned and accusatory at once. "Distracted. Off. People are starting to talk." I said I'd been tired. It was at least true. What I didn't know, that month, was that Yvette and Dr. Reyes had grown increasingly aware that someone on the unit was reporting discrepancies and had begun a quiet effort of their own, identifying who among the staff was most likely to have noticed the pattern and beginning to build a narrative that would discredit that person before they could be believed. I was the obvious candidate. I had filed the original compliance report. I worked the shifts where the discrepancies clustered. And I had, without meaning to, given them exactly the kind of behavioral evidence, withdrawn, secretive, meticulously documenting things that could be reframed with enough deliberate spin into something that looked like guilt instead of vigilance. The accusation came in June, 3 weeks before the night the FBI walked onto my floor. I was called into a meeting with Carla, hospital security, and a representative from Human Resources, and informed that an internal audit, conducted, I would later learn, largely by Yvette herself, using selectively chosen data, had identified me as the nurse most consistently associated with unexplained narcotic discrepancies over the preceding 8 months. I was placed on immediate unpaid suspension pending further investigation, escorted from the building, and told that a criminal referral to local law enforcement was under consideration. I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage for a long time after that meeting, shaking in a way I hadn't allowed myself to during the meeting itself, before calling Agent Amaro. "They're trying to make it me," I told her. Her voice, when she answered, was steady in a way that steadied me too. "Then it's time to move faster than they expect." What Agent Amaro told me next was something I hadn't fully anticipated, even after months of cooperation. The investigation had reached the point where federal agents believed they had enough evidence to move forward with search warrants, but they needed one final piece of corroborating audio to solidify the connection between Dr. Reyes and the outside pharmacy allegedly reselling the diverted medication. And the only person positioned to obtain it, given the current suspension keeping me technically off the unit, but still occasionally required to appear for HR meetings and equipment returns, was me. "You don't have to do this," she said. "You've already given us more than most people would. If you want to step back now, no one will think less of you." I thought about 8 months of being treated like a problem instead of a witness. I thought about every patient who had received a diluted or entirely absent dose of pain medication while someone profited from the difference. I told Agent Amaro I would wear the wire. The final piece of the investigation came together during a scheduled equipment return meeting at the hospital, arranged, at Agent Amaro's careful direction, to overlap with a shift change that would put both Yvette and Dr. Reyes on the floor at the same time. I wore the wire taped beneath my scrub top, my hands steadier than I expected them to be, and let a brief, unremarkable hallway conversation unfold exactly the way federal agents had hoped it might. Yvette, thinking she was speaking to someone already discredited and unlikely to be believed by anyone, said more than she should have. She mentioned, in a low voice near the supply closet, that Marcus had been handling things with a pharmacy contact and that the audit numbers pointing to me had been cleaned up enough to hold. It wasn't a full confession. It didn't need to be. Combined with months of financial records, Pyxis data, and testimony already gathered, it was the final thread that let federal prosecutors move forward with warrants that same week. I didn't know the exact night the raid would happen. Agent Amaro had told me only that it would come soon, for both operational security and, I suspect, so I wouldn't spend every shift bracing for it. I found out it was happening the same way everyone else on the floor did. When the elevator doors opened at 2 a.m. and 6 agents in FBI and DEA jackets walked out with a warrant, and Yvette Suarez, standing at the nurse's station beside me, went the color of the printer paper in her hand. Dr. Reyes was arrested the following morning at his home. The independent pharmacy on the other end of the resale pipeline was raided the same week, its owner charged alongside him. Yvette was arrested 3 days later. Once investigators finished confirming the extent of her role in both the diversion scheme and the falsified audit used to discredit me. My suspension was formally lifted within 48 hours, the criminal referral against me quietly and permanently withdrawn once federal investigators shared enough of their findings with hospital administration to make clear exactly who had falsified what. Carla Whitfield called me personally to apologize, her voice breaking slightly, saying she'd trusted the wrong data because she had known there was a reason not to. I told her I understood. I meant it mostly. It's a strange thing, forgiving someone for believing a lie you spent months proving wasn't true. The federal case took another year to fully resolve. Dr. Reyes eventually pleaded guilty to healthcare fraud and controlled substance diversion charges, receiving a multi-year federal sentence. Yvette pleaded guilty to related charges months later, cooperating in exchange for a reduced sentence that still ended her nursing career permanently. The pharmacy owner received the longest sentence of the three, having profited most directly from reselling medication meant for patients who had, in some cases, spent their final days in more pain than they should have. I testified twice during the proceedings, both times more nervous than I expected, both times steadied by the simple fact that everything I said was already backed by a paper trail I'd spent over a year building one careful entry at a time. Agent Amaro and I still get coffee occasionally. On the rare mornings our schedules overlap. She told me once, near the end of the case, that most of the healthcare diversion tips her office received came from people who noticed something wrong and reported it once, got told to drop it, and did. What made this case different, she said, wasn't that I noticed more than anyone else. It was that I refused to let being disbelieved be the end of the story. I still work nights at Miami Harbor General, on a different unit now, with a charge nurse who leaves handwritten thank you notes on good shifts instead of red ink on my charting. I mentor two newer nurses these days, and the first thing I tell both of them, usually within their first month, is the same thing I wish someone had told me a year and a half earlier. If something doesn't add up, write it down, report it through every channel available, and never assume silence means you were wrong. Sometimes it just means you were early. The last line in the notebook I kept during those months isn't something Agent Amaro said, or something I overheard in a hallway. It's something I wrote myself the morning after the raid, before I finally let myself sleep. They spent 8 months trying to convince everyone I was the problem. It never once occurred to them that the quiet ones aren't quiet because they've missed something. Sometimes they're quiet because they're the only ones paying attention.